jury duty and taxes are mandatory. So why not voting?
Here, you have to vote.
It would be transformative if everybody voted.
The US is holding a presidential election, and it's all anyone can talk about. Or at least it's all Americans can talk about. But Americans love elections so much, they sometimes go try to force them onto other countries as a magnanimous gift. But this election is particularly important. It's the only thing American politicians seem to agree on.
This election is the most important in the modern history of this country.
This is the most important election in the history of our country.
All elections are important. But we know in our bones this one is more consequential.
Despite the hype, there's every chance that this time around, just like every other US election in recent history, tens of millions of Americans won't be voting. In the 2016 presidential election, of the more than 245 million Americans old enough to vote, only 56% cast a ballot. That means a quarter of all Americans of voting age put Trump in the White House, and the rest of the world has been forced to follow along as the country tears itself apart. Low turnout isn't just an American problem. Remember Brexit? Of course you do, because it's still happening 4 years later. Only 37% of eligible British voters decided that leaving the EU was a good idea, despite 100% of the country having to live through the longest, most confusing breakup in history. So if you believe that democracy means a government for the people, by the people, it might seem strange that all the people are living with the consequences of choices made by a minority of the people. So how do you get more people to vote? For one thing, you could stop it being optional. At least 21 nations have compulsory voting laws, though they all treat the obligation differently. Some require voters to actually cast a ballot, while some just require them to turn up at the polls. The practice originated back in the 1890s, when Belgium made voting a legal requirement for men older than 20. Women at the time weren't forced to vote, because they didn't have the right until 1948. Now, Belgian voter participation hovers around 90% of eligible voters, making it one of the votiest countries in Europe. The only English-speaking country that mandates showing up is Australia, where I am now and where turnout regularly tops 90%. If you're American, you might already know this fact because American media loves pointing it out every 2 years. For countries adopting compulsory voting, it does seem to make a huge difference to turnout. Australia made turning up to the polls mandatory in 1924, after an election where less than 60% of voters participated. In the following election, that number went up to 91%. In the Netherlands, a 1917 general election only had a turnout of about 21%, soon after the country adopted compulsory voting, and at the next year's election, turnout more than quadrupled to over 88%, though it's worth mentioning the pool of eligible voters was still small, limited to Dutchmen aged 25 and older. But when the Netherlands dropped compulsory voting after 1967, participation in the following election fell nearly 15%. Chile tried something different. In 2012, they abandoned compulsory voting, but introduced compulsory registration. People arguing for the change thought it would increase political engagement. But while enrollment went up by more than 5 million, the total number of people who voted dropped. Of course, if you live in a place that requires you to vote, failure to do so generally means incurring a penalty. And not a cool penalty like in hockey where you get to have some alone time and take a rest. Usually, it's a fine. In Australia, voters who skip out on the polls need an acceptable excuse. If they don't have one, they'll get fined $20 Australian. They're kinda like American dollars, except we already have a woman on ours. One of the accepted reasons for abstaining is religious belief, which is the excuse a man from New South Wales successfully used in court. He was agnostic, the non-voters of religion. Belgian voters who don't show up face escalating fines. The first offence is €10, the second is 25. Miss 4 elections in a 15-year period and you could lose your right to vote for a decade. Which kind of feels like punishing someone who doesn't stop at a red light by telling them they should just go ahead and ignore all red lights for the next 10 years. The catch is that Belgium doesn't actually enforce these penalties. One report shows they haven't made anyone pay any election-related fines in at least 15 years, begging the age-old question: if you don't cast your vote in a forest and no one is around to enforce it, is it compulsory voting? In fact, many countries with these laws don't strongly enforce them. So what good is compulsory voting if it's not actually backed with a meaningful penalty?
I don't really think at this point it's a fear of a fine that's driving people to the booth. The very large majority of the voting public in Australia supports compulsory voting. They want to participate.
It's possible that mandating voting creates a culture of people treating voting as a civic duty. According to one poll, even without compulsory voting, 87% of Australians would probably or definitely vote. But even if Australia is a voter's paradise, for some people, a paradise you're required by law to participate in isn't a paradise at all.
I have to vote. And if I don't vote, these bastards are going to fine me.
Even countries that aren't exactly considered flourishing democracies understand that the higher the voter turnout, the more legitimate the election winner seems. In North Korea, everyone over age 17 is required to vote, and they get to choose between voting for the single candidate in their district that's been selected by the ruling party, or that's it. Some people aren't on board with compulsory voting because they value not voting as a form of protest, and some people, especially Americans, just don't particularly want to be told what to do.
Anytime the government says you have to do something, there's a lot of people out there that automatically don't want that to happen.
The hurdle for many Americans is that they see compulsory voting as pitting collective civic responsibility against something they're madly in love with, individual liberty.
The government shouldn't be able to force you to do anything, which is why I love the draft, but I have to be against it.
It's going to be mandatory? No. No one's going to tell me that I have to vote.
I think that would be pretty screwed up, to force somebody to vote against their will.
The right to vote is a choice to vote or not to vote. And if you take away that choice, you're infringing on civil liberties, but you're also removing a check on an overreaching government.
Just because everyone votes doesn't mean they're actually engaged in the process. Compulsory voting tends to increase the percentage of blank or spoiled ballots, though that might be due to unengaged citizens or engaged citizens who hate all their options. Even then, there's still a net increase of turnout across the board. Buying into mandatory voting means you've also bought into the idea that low voter turnout is bad, and that's something that some American conservatives don't agree with.
If you're not engaged enough to vote, please don't. Please, please don't. Stay home.
They want everybody to vote. I don't want everybody to vote. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections, quite candidly, goes up as the voting populace goes down.
Mandatory voting in the US might seem like a particularly distant possibility, given how much the electoral system is designed to make voting feel less like a right and more like a privilege. Across the country, election rules can vary significantly, leaving a lot of leeway for some undemocratic tactics, like closing polling places, purging voter rolls, or creating barriers to access, like fees or voter ID laws. These barriers often disproportionately affect or are targeted at non-white and minority voters' ability to cast a ballot. A recent investigation showed that Donald Trump's 2016 campaign targeted millions of black American voters with Facebook ads meant to convince them not to vote. One poll found that 25% of American non-voters said they stayed away in 2016 for a simple reason. They just didn't like the candidates or the campaign issues. And there are plenty more reasons why someone might have sat it out.
I'm not voting because I don't feel passionate enough about any of the issues.
I just feel like my vote isn't that important or would matter.
I just think that it's a waste of my time.
All the slandering they're doing to each other, I don't like that.
Voting condones a broken system.
One of the simplest obstacles to voting in the US is having a job. Most countries have an ingenious fix for that particular obstacle. They hold elections on the weekend. The UK doesn't. Its elections are on Thursdays, for reasons no one entirely knows, though one theory is that since payday was historically on Friday, everyone would be too busy getting wasted that weekend to turn up. And the US, the country that wants to be #1 for making things complicated, votes on the Tuesday after the first Monday in November. Many US politicians don't even know why.
Okay, I'm going to be stumped on this. Anybody know why we vote on Tuesdays?
I don't know how that originated.
Do you happen to know why we do vote on Tuesday? No.
But there's a very reasonable explanation. The US established Tuesday voting in 1845. Sunday was ruled out because people would naturally be in church, and those who weren't were likely busy hiding the fact that they weren't in church. People who travelled home from church on Sunday in their horse-drawn buggies didn't have time to turn around and travel somewhere else for a Monday election. And the people who hadn't gone to church were still busy pretending that they had. So Tuesday was chosen for its convenience to those pre-Civil War Americans who could vote. See? A perfectly reasonable explanation. It's easy to see how slapping a compulsory voting law on an already outdated system would probably create even more problems for working people. If only there was some way to mark a weekday as a widely agreed upon special day that means most people don't have to work.
Why isn't Election Day a national holiday?
54% of voters said Election Day should be a federal holiday.
Making Election Day a federal holiday would create a uniform standard across the country to encourage voting.
Compulsory voting might not be some simple fix for all the challenges and flaws of democracy. You can't guarantee that everyone who's made to vote will take the time to engage in the process. But at the very least, it can get voters to the polls, strengthen the mandate of sitting officials, and pressure politicians to think about their entire country as potential voters, rather than just their already energized base. Or maybe you enjoy the American cottage industry solution. A many months-long cavalcade of celebrities and brands telling you, and sometimes begging you, to go vote. Who doesn't love that?
Get out and vote.
Take your clothes off and vote.
Register to vote and be a VILF.
Voting is fundamental to the success of our democracy.
You have an obligation
To be a part of that decision.
Exercise your right to vote.
Vote. Vote.
Vote!